So here's a big question for you. Was the United States Constitution, the bedrock of American law and liberty, actually designed to protect human bondage? Today we're going to dive into the pretty provocative historical argument that the nation's founding document was, in fact, a compact built specifically to safeguard the institution of slavery.
A covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Wow. Those are the searing words of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. You see, he didn't see the Constitution as some beacon of freedom. To him, it was a dirty bargain. This quote really sets the stage for a dramatic re-examination of what was really decided back in Philadelphia in 1787. Okay, let's get into this.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start by really understanding Garrison's fiery point of view. Then we'll unpack the fierce debates they had over representation. After that, we'll look at the specific clauses that were put in place to protect slavery, expose the critical, dirty compromise that basically sealed the deal, and finally, look at the Constitution as a whole as a compact for slavery.
All right, so let's start with that Garrisonian perspective. For guys like Garrison and his followers, the Union itself was just corrupt. Why? Because it was built on a pro-slavery foundation. They believed that any kind of political activity under this Constitution only tightened slavery's chokehold on the nation.
Historian Paul Finkelman really builds on this idea. He argues the Constitution wasn't just neutral on slavery, it was actively pro-slavery. He uses this really striking phrase for it, calling it a form of affirmative action for the master class. The idea is that it was deliberately written to give special protections and big advantages to slave owners.
Okay, let's go back in time to the convention in 1787. Now, the delegates weren't just fighting about big states versus small states. As James Madison himself pointed out, the real division, the most dangerous one, was between the North and the South, and it all came down to one thing: slavery. This was the absolute nightmare question they faced. The Virginia Plan proposed that representation in Congress should be based on population. Sounds fair, right? But that immediately created a huge problem that almost tore the convention apart. What do you do with the nearly 700,000 enslaved people in the country? Do you count them? And if you do, how?
What's really fascinating here is the language they used. The word slave doesn't appear anywhere in the original Constitution, not once. Instead, they use these really careful euphemisms like other persons or person held to service. This tells you that the delegates knew exactly how controversial this all was. They were almost ashamed to even name the institution they were working so hard to protect.
Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, well, he didn't mince words. This quote just perfectly captures the raw anger from the North. To a lot of them, counting enslaved people for representation was just like giving Southern voters extra political power for their livestock. It was completely illogical and, frankly, insulting.
And all of this fighting led to one of the most infamous compromises in American history, the 3/5 Clause. Now, it's often linked to taxation, but really that was just a justification they added later. At its core, this clause was purely about political power. It was a way to give Southern states more seats in Congress and a lot more influence in the federal government.
And the debate was just intense. William Patterson from New Jersey really hammered on the fundamental hypocrisy of it all. He basically argued, look, if enslaved people are property, with no rights, no liberty, and no will of their own, then how on earth can they be represented in a government of free people?
But the 3/5 Clause, that was just the beginning. The delegates went on to build an architecture of protection for slavery. They embedded its safeguards into the very structure of the document, piece by piece.
Finkelman points to 5 clauses that directly protected slavery. First, the 3/5 Clause we've been talking about. Second, the Slave Importation Clause, which stopped Congress from banning the horrific African slave trade for at least 20 years. Third, the Capitation Tax Clause, which made sure any federal head tax would be skewed by that 3/5 rule, protecting slave wealth. Fourth, you've got the Fugitive Slave Clause, forcing free states to return escaped slaves. And finally, a clause that explicitly blocked any amendment to the slave trade rule until 1808. They literally locked it in.
And the protections didn't stop there. Other clauses indirectly guarded the institution. For example, the Constitution gave the federal government power to suppress domestic insurrections, which everyone understood was code for slave rebellions. The ban on taxing exports? Well, that protected all the profitable crops produced by slave labor. Even the Electoral College was a safeguard, since it boosted the South's power in presidential elections thanks to the 3/5 count. It all added up to a system where slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was actively protected.
So, how did all this stuff get into the Constitution?
Well, it came down to a moment of raw political horse trading, what a lot of historians now call the dirty compromise. This was the critical bargain between the commerce-driven states of New England and the slave economies of the Deep South.
So here you can see the competing interests laid out pretty clearly. The South's #1 priority was protecting the slave trade and making sure their export crops didn't get taxed by the new federal government. New England, on the other hand, really wanted Congress to have the power to regulate all commerce, which would be a huge boon for their shipping industry. You see, they each had something the other one desperately wanted.
You had guys like Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, who just framed the slave trade as a simple economic issue. He argued against interfering with it, basically saying that the profits from slavery and shipping its products were a matter of national economic benefit. For him, morality definitely took a backseat to profit.
And then you have Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina just laying his cards on the table. For him, this wasn't some philosophical debate, it was an ultimatum. He said the Deep South couldn't survive without enslaved people. It was a non-negotiable condition for them to even join the Union. And so the bargain was struck. New England's delegates agreed to support a 20-year extension of the African slave trade. In return, the delegates from the Deep South dropped their demand for a supermajority on commerce laws, giving Congress the power to regulate it with just a simple vote. It was a direct quid pro quo.
And we don't have to guess that this happened. James Madison recorded it all in his own notes. He wrote that there was an explicit understanding between the North and South on these two issues. It was a documented deal.
This dirty compromise broke the deadlock, and it really paved the way for the final draft of the Constitution. It cemented slavery's place in the new nation and gave slaveholders an enormous amount of security and power.
And the effect was immediate. I mean, the very next day after this compromise was made, the Fugitive Slave Clause, which had faced opposition before, was brought back to the floor. And this time, it passed. Without any debate, without even a recorded vote. The deal was done.
And this final quote, it says it all. Reporting back to the South Carolina legislature, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was basically boasting about the deal they had secured. He proudly declared that they had gotten the best possible terms to protect their species of property. There's just no ambiguity there at all.
So we're left with a really challenging question. Understanding that the original Constitution contained these deep, intentional protections for slavery forces us to ask, how does this complex and very difficult history shape our understanding of this foundational document and its legacy today?